I never expected that a busted pipe in the apartment above mine would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It's funny how the biggest shifts often start not with a bang, but with a drip. A persistent, annoying, and, as it turned out, life-altering drip. My name is Lucas, and at the time, my world was a carefully curated space of quiet order. As a freelance graphic designer, my apartment was my office, my sanctuary, and my entire universe on most days. I had my routine down to a science. Coffee at 7, work from 8 until noon, a short walk to the park for lunch, then back to the grind until the soft glow of my monitor was the only light in the room. It was a peaceful existence, but a solitary one. The silence in my apartment wasn't just an absence of noise. Sometimes, it felt like a presence all its own. My building was old, with the kind of charming thin walls that let you become intimately familiar with your neighbors' habits without ever learning their names. I knew the woman in 3A practiced the cello on Tuesday evenings, and the couple in 2C had a disagreement about garlic every other Saturday. And then there was Caleb, in 3B, directly above me. He was less of a sound and more of a vibration. The solid, heavy tread of work boots in the morning, the low thrum of a bass guitar in the evening, the occasional loud, genuine laugh that would travel down through the floorboards and make me smile without knowing why. I saw him, of course, in the mundane intersections of apartment life, by the mailboxes, in the laundry room, holding the door. He was a carpenter, or something like it. He had broad shoulders, sawdust often clinging to his worn jeans, and hands that looked like they knew how to build things, to fix what was broken. He had a kind face, warm brown eyes, and a smile that seemed to light up the dim hallway. To me, he was a sunbeam in a dusty corner, and I was just part of the dust. He was confident, friendly in that easy, casual way that some people just are. He'd nod and say, "Hey, how's it going?" And I'd manage a quiet, "Good, you," before scurrying away, my heart doing a stupid little flip-flop. In my mind, he was a fixed point in a different constellation. He was the guy who probably had a beautiful girlfriend, who spent his weekends hiking with friends, and a golden retriever, who lived a life full of noise and laughter and connection. He was, in every way I could imagine, completely and totally straight. So I filed him away under unattainable and tried to ignore the way my day felt a little brighter after one of our 2-second encounters. That was my life. Orderly, predictable, and safe. Until the rain came. It wasn't just rain. It was a biblical deluge, a freak summer storm that clawed at the sky and threw water at the city with a vengeance. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. It was the kind of storm that makes you feel very small and very grateful for a solid roof over your head. Or what you assume is a solid roof. The first drip landed on a stack of art books on my coffee table. I barely noticed it over the symphony of the storm. The second landed on my cheek. I looked up and saw it, a small, dark, circular stain on the white plaster of my ceiling. It looked like a tiny, sad eye weeping. As I watched, another tear fell, and then another. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I knew exactly what was happening. Trouble in 3B was becoming trouble in 2B. I grabbed a bucket from under the sink just as the drip turned into a steady trickle. The dark stain on the ceiling grew, blooming like some sort of terrible watercolor painting. I tried calling my landlord, but his phone went straight to a full voicemail box. The building's emergency maintenance line just rang and rang, unanswered. I imagined every plumber in the city was currently battling a torrent of their own. I was alone with my bucket, which was filling up with an alarming speed. The steady plink 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 was becoming a maddening rhythm, the soundtrack to my rising panic. I was pacing, trying to figure out what to do, when a loud, frantic banging on my door made me jump out of my skin. It wasn't a polite knock, it was the sound of desperation. I opened the door to find Caleb standing there. He was a mess. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his t-shirt was soaked through, and water was literally dripping from the tip of his nose. He looked shaken, his usual easy confidence completely washed away. Behind him, I could see water pooling in the hallway, seeping out from under his door. "My place is flooding," he said, his voice tight with stress. "A pipe burst in the wall behind my water heater. It's everywhere. The landlord isn't answering. I can't stay there." He ran a hand through his wet hair, looking utterly defeated. He glanced past me, into my apartment, and saw the bucket on the floor. His shoulders slumped. "Oh man, it's coming through to you." "It's just a leak," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "It's manageable." My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the rain and the drip. He looked at me then, his brown eyes wide and pleading. "Look, I know this is a huge ask, and we don't really know each other, but is there any chance I could just crash here? On your couch? Just for tonight, until I can figure this out in the morning." My carefully ordered world, my quiet, solitary sanctuary, was being invaded. And the strangest part? My first thought wasn't annoyance or inconvenience. It was a dizzying, terrifying surge of something that felt a lot like hope. "Yeah," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant. "Yeah, of course. Come in." Caleb stood awkwardly in my entryway, dripping onto the welcome mat. He looked around my small, tidy apartment as if he'd entered a foreign country. He was so much larger in here than he was in the hallway, his presence filling the space, changing its entire dynamic. The quiet was gone, replaced by the sound of his breathing and the squelch of his wet shoes. "I'm so sorry about this, man," he said, shaking his head. "And for your ceiling. I'll cover whatever the landlord doesn't." "Don't worry about it," I told him, grabbing a few towels from the linen closet. "It's not your fault pipes get old." I handed him the towels. "You should get out of those wet clothes." The words hung in the air for a second, feeling far more loaded than I intended. A faint blush crept up my neck. He didn't seem to notice, just nodded gratefully and disappeared into my small bathroom. While he was changing, I busied myself making tea, needing something to do with my hands. The familiar ritual of boiling water and finding mugs was grounding. When he came out, he was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants and an old college t-shirt I'd given him. They were too short on him, the sweatpants ending a few inches above his ankles, and the shirt stretching taut across his chest and shoulders. The sight was both comical and strangely intimate. "Thanks," he said, gesturing to the clothes. "I owe you big time." He accepted the mug of tea, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around it. We sat in a slightly awkward silence on opposite ends of my couch, listening to the rain and the drip, drip, drip into the bucket. To break the silence, I asked him about his work. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. He talked about wood, about the grain and the feel of it, about turning a rough piece of timber into something beautiful and functional. He wasn't just a carpenter, he was an artist. He spoke with a passion that was captivating. I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word. Later, as we were figuring out what to do for dinner, my kitchen offerings were meager at best. He grew quiet again. His gaze drifted toward the dripping ceiling. "It's not the big stuff I'm worried about," he said, his voice soft. "The TV, the furniture, that's all just stuff. It's replaceable," he sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "But I had this box, this old shoebox on the floor of my closet, full of photos of my mom. She passed away a few years ago." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes. The confident, easygoing guy from the hallway was gone, replaced by someone who looked heartbroken. "And I was working on these little wooden animals," he continued, a sad smile touching his lips, "for a charity auction for the children's hospital. They were all lined up on a low shelf, getting their last coat of finish. A whole menagerie. I'm pretty sure they're all floating right now." My carefully constructed image of him shattered into a million pieces. This man, who I'd seen as some kind of untouchable masculine ideal, was sentimental. He cherished old photos of his mother and spent his free time carving toys for sick kids. The attraction I'd felt from a distance, that quiet, hopeless crush, suddenly deepened into something more potent, more real. It was a dangerous feeling. We ended up ordering a pizza, the delivery guy braving the storm with a heroic sense of duty. We ate it sitting on the floor, using the coffee table as our makeshift dining table. The awkwardness from earlier had melted away, replaced by an easy camaraderie. We talked about movies, about terrible first jobs, about the city. He had a great laugh, a full-bodied, genuine sound that made me want to say funny things just to hear it again. After we finished, we started clearing away the boxes and paper plates. As I reached for the dish towel I'd left on the counter, his hand went for it at the same time. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact that lasted for less than a second. But it felt like a jolt of static electricity, a sudden, sharp shock that made the hairs on my arm stand up. I pulled my hand back instinctively. He did, too, maybe a little too quickly. I risked a glance at his face. His smile was gone, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion, maybe? Surprise? I couldn't be sure. He cleared his throat and looked away, grabbing a paper towel instead. I'll wipe the table, he mumbled. The easy atmosphere was gone, and the charged silence was back, thicker than before. I stood at the sink, my heart pounding, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The next day, the rain didn't stop. It settled into a miserable, persistent drizzle that seeped into everything, including my mood. The air in the apartment felt heavy with unspoken things. Caleb had spent the night on the couch, and I'd spent it in my bed, wide awake, replaying that tiny moment at the sink over and over again in my mind. In the morning, he insisted on going up to his apartment to assess the damage and see what he could salvage. I need to at least try, he'd said, his jaw set with determination. I lent him my rain jacket, which was, like my sweatpants, comically small on him, but he just laughed and thanked me. I watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. He was gone for hours. The dripping from my ceiling slowed to a crawl and then stopped altogether, which I took as a good sign. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to him, up there in his ruined apartment, surrounded by water and loss. I worried about him. It was a strange, new feeling, this deep-seated concern for someone I barely knew. When he finally returned, it was late afternoon. He didn't knock. I heard his key fumbling at my lock before he remembered it wasn't his door, and then a soft tap. When I opened it, my breath caught in my chest. He was a drowned man. My rain jacket had clearly been no match for the deluge. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes dark and heavy with water, clinging to his frame. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue, and he was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable shivering that shook his entire body. It's sea cold, he chattered, his teeth clicking together. He looked dazed, his eyes glassy. He stumbled inside, leaving a puddle on the floor. Panic shot through me, sharp and cold. Caleb, you need to get out of those wet clothes right now, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I kicked the door shut and steered him toward the bathroom, my hands on his trembling shoulders. He felt like ice. I turned the shower on as hot as it would go, filling the small room with steam. Get in there, I ordered. Stay until you can feel your fingers again. He just nodded, too cold to argue. While he was in the shower, I stripped the blankets and comforter off my bed, throwing them in the dryer to warm them up. I made him another mug of tea, this time with a generous splash of whiskey I kept for emergencies. This definitely qualified. When he finally emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in my largest towel, he was still shivering, though not as violently. He drank the tea in shuddering sips, but it didn't seem to be enough. He sat on the edge of my couch, huddled under a fresh towel, looking small and miserable. I pulled the heated blankets from the dryer and wrapped them around his shoulders. The warmth was a stark contrast to the icy chill still radiating from his skin. He leaned into them, his eyes closing for a moment, but the shivering persisted, a deep, rhythmic tremor that seemed to come from his very bones. Still so cold, he whispered, his voice hoarse. He looked up at me, and his gaze was intense, desperate. The steam from the shower had left his hair in damp curls, and his eyes seemed huge in his pale face. He held my gaze for a long, charged moment, a silent communication passing between us that I couldn't decipher. Then he said it. The words were quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain outside, but they landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. I'm so cold, Lucas, he said, his voice barely a tremor. They say warmth works better skin to skin. The world seemed to stop. The rain, the dripping bucket, the hum of the dryer, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. All I could see were his eyes, wide and searching, asking a question I was terrified to answer. Was this a desperate, delirious plea from a man suffering from hypothermia? Or was it something else? A gamble? An invitation? My mind raced, a frantic collision of fear and a wild, improbable hope. My fear screamed at me that I was misreading this, that he was just sick and I was projecting all my secret fantasies onto him. But my hope, a fragile, stubborn thing, whispered that this was a door opening, a chance I had to be brave enough to take. My own body started to tremble, but not from cold. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. I looked at him, huddled and shivering, and my concern for him finally won out over my own fear. Okay. I breathed, the word feeling enormous. Okay. The next few minutes were a surreal blur. I helped him to my bedroom, my hands clumsy as I pulled back the covers on my bed. I turned away, giving him a moment of privacy as he shed the damp towel. The air was thick with a tension so profound it was almost a physical presence. I took off my own shirt and jeans, leaving me in my boxers, feeling impossibly exposed. When I turned back, he was already under the covers, a pale shape in the dim light of my bedroom. I slid into the bed beside him. The space between us felt like a canyon. He was still shaking, his body rigid with cold. Taking another shaky breath, I moved closer until my chest was pressed against his back. His skin was shockingly cold, like touching marble in winter. A violent shiver racked his whole frame as I made contact, and a soft, desperate sound escaped his lips. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him tight against me, trying to pour my own body heat into his. It was the most intimate thing I had ever done. I could feel every shudder that passed through him, the sharp angles of his shoulder blades, the lean muscle of his back. My mind was screaming, a chaotic inner monologue of, "What are you doing? And is this real?" But I forced it quiet, focusing on the simple, physical reality of the moment. He was cold, and I was warm. That was all that mattered. Slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it at first, the violent shivers began to subside. They softened into smaller tremors, and then into a faint, intermittent trembling. The rigid tension in his muscles began to ease, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body relaxing against mine. The heat was transferring. It was working. He shifted slightly, settling his weight more fully against me. His head rested near my shoulder, his damp hair brushing against my neck. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against my arm, gradually finding a calmer rhythm. I lay there, completely still, my own heart pounding enough for the both of us. The minutes stretched into an hour, maybe more. I lost all track of time. The only things that existed were the warmth building between us, the sound of his breathing deepening into the slow, even cadence of sleep, and the heavy, solid weight of him in my arms. He was asleep, safe, and warm. And I was wide awake, terrified and exhilarated, holding the entire, impossible world in my arms. The morning light that filtered through my blinds felt accusatory. It crept across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the man sleeping beside me. I hadn't slept at all. I had spent the entire night lying perfectly still, listening to Caleb's breathing, acutely aware of every point of contact between our bodies. My arm had gone numb hours ago, but I hadn't dared to move. As the sun grew brighter, he began to stir. He shifted, stretching slightly, and then his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was a sleepy confusion in them. Then, awareness dawned. He realized where he was, who he was with. He went rigid, and then pulled away from me so quickly it felt like a physical rejection. He sat up, pushing the covers back, careful not to look at me. "Morning," I said, my voice rough with disuse. It sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice directed at the wall. He ran a hand over his face. "Man, I feel much better. Thanks. I was really out of it last night." He was talking fast, a nervous energy radiating off him. The intimacy of the night, the shared warmth and vulnerability, had evaporated, leaving behind a thick, suffocating awkwardness. He stood up and started gathering the clothes I'd given him the day before, which I had put through the dryer and left on my desk chair. "I should, get out of your hair," he said, still avoiding my eyes. "I really appreciate everything, Lucas. Seriously, you were a lifesaver." The way he said it felt like he was closing a door, framing last night as nothing more than a medical emergency. A transaction. He was cold. I provided warmth. End of story. Every insecure part of me screamed, "I told you so." Of course it was nothing. I had been a fool to let that fragile hope take root. He was just being practical. Skin to skin. A survival technique. That's all. Just then, his phone, which he'd left on my nightstand, buzzed. He snatched it up. It was his landlord. I could only hear his side of the conversation, A series of okay and understood, and that's great. When he hung up, he finally looked at me, but his expression was carefully neutral. So, good news, he said, forcing a small smile. The landlord got a crew to come out today. They're going to start drying the place out. He said his insurance will put me up in a hotel for a few days while they do the repairs. Oh, I said. My voice was flat. That's good. It was the sensible, logical resolution. It was also the end of this strange, temporary bubble we had been living in. He would go to a hotel, and then back to his apartment, and I would go back to mine. The invisible wall between 2B and 3B would be re-erected, stronger than before, cemented by this new layer of awkwardness between us. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of polite, stilted conversation. He packed the few dry things he'd salvaged into a gym bag. I made coffee, and we drank it standing in the kitchen, a careful foot of space between us at all times. The air was buzzing with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to ask him about last night, about that look in his eyes before he'd made his desperate suggestion. I wanted to ask if he had felt anything at all, lying there in my arms. But I couldn't. The fear of hearing him say, "Dude, I was freezing to death. What are you talking about?" was too great. When it was time for him to go, he paused at the door. "Listen, Lucas," he started, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to say something real. "I can't thank you enough. For everything. I'll get your clothes back to you, and I'll pay for any damage to your ceiling. Just let me know." "It's fine, Caleb. Don't worry about it," I said, my own smile feeling stiff and unnatural on my face. He gave a final nod, a quick, almost smile, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. My apartment felt huge and empty. It smelled faintly of him, a clean, woodsy scent that now felt like a cruel reminder. I stood in the middle of my living room for a long time, staring at the bucket, which had only a few inches of water in it now. The storm was over. The crisis had passed, and I had never felt more lonely in my entire life. I replayed the events over and over in my head, a relentless loop of analysis. The way he looked at me when he said it. Warmth works better skin to skin. Had it been a question? A test? Or was I just a desperate, lonely guy seeing what I wanted to see in the glassy eyes of a man who was simply trying not to freeze? I dissected every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression. The way our hands touched, the way he relaxed against me in the dark, the frantic way he'd pulled away in the morning. My hope and my fear were at war. Hope whispered that he had felt it too, that he had used his very real predicament as a shield to ask for something he wanted, but was too afraid to ask for directly. Fear screamed back that I was pathetic, that I had taken advantage of his vulnerability, that I had turned an act of simple human kindness into a romantic fantasy. Fear, as always, had the louder voice. I spent the rest of the day in a miserable haze, convinced I had imagined everything and made a complete fool of myself. Late that evening, I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a movie I couldn't focus on, when there was a knock on the door. My heart leaped into my throat. I thought it might be the landlord or a neighbor. I told myself it couldn't possibly be him. He was at a hotel across town, starting the process of putting his life back together. But when I opened the door, there he was. Caleb. He was wearing dry clothes, jeans and a dark green sweater, and he was holding a six-pack of beer. He looked incredibly nervous. His eyes darted around, anywhere but at my face. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. Can I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside, my mind a complete blank. He walked in and set the beer on the coffee table. He didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of the room, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his tell for when he was anxious. "I'm not at a hotel," he said abruptly. "I mean, I have a room. The landlord booked it, but I just drove around for a while." Thinking, he finally met my eyes, and his were filled with a terrifying sincerity. "I need to. I can't leave things the way they were this morning. It wasn't right." I just waited, my breath caught in my chest. "Look, Lucas," he took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into icy water. "Last night, I wasn't lying. I was freezing. I really was. But I wasn't dying. I was exaggerating. I could have just put on more blankets or taken another hot shower." My heart started pounding, a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. I didn't know where this was going, but I knew it was the precipice of something. I used the storm as an excuse, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush now. The first night, to ask if I could stay here. And then last night. I was cold, but I also just. I wanted an excuse to be close to you. He shook his head, a look of self-deprecating frustration on his face. I've wanted to talk to you for months. For longer than that, maybe. Every time I'd see you in the hall or by the mailboxes, I'd tell myself, just say something. Ask him for a coffee, but I'm so bad at this stuff. I see you, and you have this quiet, gentle way about you, and I freeze up. It's ridiculous, right? I can build a house with my bare hands, but I can't talk to the guy who lives downstairs. I stared at him, dumbfounded. My entire world had just been flipped upside down. All the anxiety, the overthinking, the self-doubt, it was all just noise. The truth was simpler and scarier and more wonderful than anything I could have imagined. I panicked this morning, he continued, his voice softer now. Waking up like that, with you. It felt too real. It scared me. So I ran. And I've felt like a complete idiot ever since. What I should have done was stay. What I should have done, he said, taking a hesitant step closer to me, is this. He closed the distance between us, his large, warm hands coming up to cup my face. His thumbs gently stroked my cheeks. He searched my eyes, looking for permission. I must have given it, because he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It wasn't like the movies. There was no orchestra, no sudden downpour of rose petals. It was quiet and hesitant at first, a question. And then, as I leaned into him, as my hands came up to rest on his chest, it deepened. It was a kiss full of all the unspoken conversations in the hallway, all the nervous energy, all the pent-up hope and fear. It tasted faintly of coffee and courage. It was a release, a confirmation. It was the end of the storm and the beginning of everything else. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. So, he said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. I guess you're not the only one who had a leak. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. I guess not. The weeks that followed were a blur of discovery. Caleb's apartment took a while to repair, but neither of us was in any hurry. He stayed with me, his gym bag of salvaged clothes in the corner of my bedroom slowly being replaced by neatly folded stacks in my dresser drawers. My solitary apartment was no longer quiet. It was filled with his laughter, the low strum of his guitar, and the easy back and forth of two people learning the rhythms of each other's lives. We went on dates. We walked in the park where I used to eat my lunch alone, but now our hands were intertwined. I showed him my design projects, explaining the intricacies of fonts and color theory. He took me to his workshop, a beautiful, chaotic space that smelled of sawdust and varnish. I watched, mesmerized, as he took a block of plain maple and, with patient, skillful hands, coaxed the shape of a fox from it. We learned the small, important things. He liked his coffee black, hated cilantro, and could sleep through anything. I learned that he hummed when he was concentrating, that he had a surprisingly goofy sense of humor, and that his confident exterior hid a deep well of kindness and sensitivity. The man I had invented in my head, the sunbeam in another constellation, was so much less interesting than the real, complicated, wonderful man who now fell asleep next to me every night. My world, once so small and orderly, had expanded to make room for him, and it felt more right than I ever could have imagined. A few months later, we were lying in my bed, the curtains drawn against a soft, gentle rain that was tapping a peaceful rhythm against the window pane. It was a cozy, lazy Sunday morning. Caleb was propped up on an elbow, looking down at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. He reached out and tucked a piece of my hair behind my ear. You know, he said, his voice a low rumble. This is still the best way to stay warm. I smiled, a wide, easy smile that reached my eyes. I leaned up and kissed him, a slow, comfortable kiss that tasted like home. The memory of that frantic, desperate night was no longer a source of anxiety. It had become our foundation myth, the story we would one day tell, the joke that was only ours. It was the moment the door to this new life had been thrown open. I never expected that a flooded ceiling would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. Sometimes the biggest storms aren't the ones that break things apart, but the ones that wash away the walls we build around ourselves, leaving behind something new and true. And for the first time in a long, long time, My life didn't feel quiet because it was empty, but because it was finally, peacefully full.